I'm going to go and get started. It's about 1 after 12, so we officially started at 12. Welcome to, I believe, our third speaker for the Workshop in Cultural Affairs speaker series. We're very excited to have you here with us, and obviously we're very excited to have our speaker for the day, Jennifer Benoit-Bryan from Slover Linett Audience Research. I won't go on about Jen. However, I'll note that she has been leading a large data collection effort at Slover Linett that we're eagerly anticipating hearing from Jen about, which is the part of the subject she'll be talking about today. But the topic of her talk is culture and community in a time of transformation. So like usual, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, use the raise hand function, or put something in the chat and I'll be monitoring, and I will help Jen keep track of everything as well so she can focus on giving the presentation and doing questions as opposed to monitoring everything. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers. Thank you so much, Jen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Joanna and Julia, for inviting me here into the O'Neill School's Center for Cultural Affairs for doing this series. I've already really enjoyed the speakers before me and look forward to the rest of the series coming up this fall and winter. I'll just share my screen. Let's see, can everybody see that okay? Yes, excellent. Thank you. So I'm really delighted to be here. It's such a pleasure to be able to put some of these findings out into the world. We are not quite yet at our publication date for this research, but we have a lot of emerging findings that we're still grappling with and making meaning of, and it's a real pleasure to bring these to you all today. And I really welcome you to share your thoughts. I'm eager to hear kind of what resonates with you, what's surprising, and to potentially make some meaning from this together. I'm focused here on the second wave of findings from this national survey we've been conducting around culture, community, and the arts during COVID-19. This is something that really started back in March of 2020, as we were thinking about how we could step into a bit of a void in terms of what arts and culture organizations might need to rethink how they're engaging with their communities and connecting with people during a pandemic like COVID-19. We partnered with LaPlaca Cohen and Yancey Consulting to really dive into this together and think collaboratively about kind of what information we could provide and how we could potentially support arts and culture organizations here. I'll just start there with the fact that this has been an effort across many different organizations really contributing and supporting this. We have 8 foundations that have been helping to fund this research over the last 2 years. Even some private sector organizations who have contributed in-kind donations towards helping the arts and culture sector really get a sense of what audiences and communities need. And then this core partnership, the team at LaPlaca Cohen and Yancey Consulting have been really integral to this work. We also have an expert advisory panel of 10 people across the sector. I see Zahava Deering is on with us today. She's one of our expert advisors. Who have really helped us think about this in new and different ways and to broaden our own interpretation of these findings. But just a little bit of a note about what we feel like distinguishes this study from some of the other really excellent data collection efforts that are happening in the field during COVID. In part, that has to do with scale, that we have more than 75,000 responses in each of the 2 waves of data collection here that's giving us just such an amazing playground of data to really explore and to dive into in a lot of depth and nuance. We're working with statisticians at NORC to really think about how to weight this data effectively so that we can talk about national implications of the data, really thinking about the average American and not just the people who are already in the orbit of arts and culture organizations and attending them already. And then open access has been a core part of our work here. We've made the research instruments all available, all the data tables are available, and the data sets actually being used by a number of mostly academic researchers already. We're happy to share that with any of you. If you're interested, please just send me a note. I mentioned this is the second wave of this national survey. Taking a moment to look back, we did that first wave of data collection in May of 2020. There were 124,000 respondents to that first wave of the survey, and there are 2 reports available from that, both on our website. One was primarily authored by the team at LaPlaca-Cohen and is kind of a key findings summary level of the data in kind of bite-sized format, and then a more detailed narrative exploration that our team at Slover Linett put together that goes into more depth, particularly around race and ethnicity and how there are differences across many of these questions and themes with respect to race and ethnicity. In between the 2 survey waves, we did an exploration with interviews with 50 Black and African Americans across the country, and that was kind of motivated by 2 main questions. One of them was some really interesting patterns and responses for Black and African Americans in that first wave of the study that we wanted to explore and understand in more depth. Also, we were rethinking the ways that we were asking some of the questions for wave 2 and wanted to explore kind of how we define arts and culture and some of the other terms on the survey in more depth through these interviews. There's a full report coming out from that research that will be available at the end of November on our site. And then now we're focused on wave 2, the second wave of the national survey. We had 78,000 respondents to this research, and it's data that was collected in May of 2021. So some things have changed in the landscape since then. We've had a surge of COVID and the Delta variant. So just keep that kind of data collection time period in mind as we walk through some of this data. We'll have reports coming out in November. That will be the culture track report that's at that very high level of summary. And then January will be our more detailed narrative report with lots of splits and exploration across the waves and across different comparison groups. We've also have a few kind of sub-reports coming out from wave 2. This focus on Massachusetts, funded by the Barr Foundation, a focus on libraries supported by IMLS, and a focus on creative aging, which has been really interesting to explore the 55+ population in more depth and nuance, supported by the Aroha Foundation. So who did we talk to? Who did we hear from in this second wave of research? There were 2 main sources of sample for this. We heard from around 3,500, 3,600 people through NORC's AmeriSpeak panel, which is really one of the most rigorous panels available that provides a probability sample of the US population. In that sample, there's a 2,000 that are just general population sample. And then we worked with the statisticians at NORC to actually oversample from some groups that were really underrepresented in wave 1 on the list of arts and culture organizations to boost the reliability of those estimates a little bit further. We also reached out to tons of arts and culture organizations and invited them to send the survey out to a portion of their lists. And so we have 74,000 responses that came in through the mailing list of these 500+ arts and culture organizations across the sector. We've got some infographics here to show kind of the range of sector organizations that participated. Museums and collections and performing arts are really present, but we worked to actually broaden the sample in wave 2 to include more parks, zoos and botanical gardens, libraries, cultural centers, arts services, fairs and festivals, some for-profit organizations in addition to nonprofit, just to try to continue to diversify that sample. And I think there are some indications that we had some success there. Another degree or dimension along which we wanted to diversify that sample was the proportion who primarily are serving a BIPOC community. That was 13% in wave 2. I believe it was 7%. It was definitely under 10 in wave 1. So that was great. Then one last kind of method slide before we get into the findings here. This just presents an overview of some of the demographics of this combined sample. So I mentioned that we had these 2 sources of data, the probability sample from AmeriSpeak and the list samples from these arts and culture organizations. And we worked with those statisticians at NORC to use the probability sample as a framework that would tell us what the proportions should be along all of these different responses in the sample that's representative of the US population as a whole. And then they helped us kind of downweight and fit in this huge oversample of people from the lists of arts and culture organizations into that, so that we have one combined sample that's been weighted to be representative of the US population as a whole. And that's what I'll be sharing results on today. But we also still have the nuance and the depth. So if we wanted to really do a deep dive into opera goers or into Hispanic or Latinx Americans, we have enough sample there to be able to do that depth and dive with more nuance. there any questions about what we did or who we talked to before we continue on into what we learned? Feel free to pepper them in. I'm happy to pause at any time to hear from you. Okay, so some key findings. I'll start with one that is a little bit perplexing to us, interesting and exciting, but also a little perplexing, and that's about the rising importance of arts and culture organizations. So you can see here we've broken out across each racial and ethnic group the proportion who told us that arts and culture organizations are important to them personally. And this is the people who rated this a 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale. And you can see that among each of these racial and ethnic groups, the proportion has jumped fairly substantially between wave 1 and wave 2. The jump has been particularly high for Asian or Pacific Islanders, and a little bit more moderate, but still a sizable jump in the proportion across all of these racial and ethnic groups. So when we look at the overall across everyone, we see that over a year into the pandemic, 56% of Americans viewed arts and culture organizations as important to them. When we asked that same question in wave 1, we heard that the importance was high among just 40% of Americans. And we also asked them to reflect back in wave 1 about before the pandemic, what was the importance. It was a little lower when they were thinking about that reflection to pre-pandemic times at 37%. So some consistency and rise in importance across arts and culture organizations, and much higher levels of importance among each racial and ethnic group compared to white or Caucasians here, which is also really fascinating. So please feel free to pepper in the chat or to unmute if you have ideas about what this might mean. We're thinking a lot about it. We've run some regressions to try to isolate what else is influencing this kind of importance metric, which have been helpful, but curious to hear what you all think of that. Another dimension that we asked about here is the importance of having reflections of cultural identity present in arts and culture organizations. And we asked about it at 2 different levels. The first one was really around importance of having a local venue that focuses on arts and culture reflective of someone's cultural identity. We saw that that was particularly important to Black or African Americans at 57%, but also in the 40s and 50s for most other BIPOC race and ethnicities, much lower for white or Caucasians at 25%. And we heard from people both in our cognitive interviews that we did, testing the survey questions out before the survey launched, but also in write-in options here, that cultural identity could mean a lot of things. For many people, it was related to race and ethnicity. We also heard a lot about gender identity, religious identity, even hobbies or personal passions that sort of connect to people's sense of cultural identity. We asked too about the importance of having online offerings that are reflective of cultural identity, and saw fairly similar levels of importance across race and ethnicity for that dimension of this, which was interesting. One of the other questions, which we asked about in both waves of the survey actually, is about whether or not there's a role for arts and cultural organizations to be playing in supporting their communities during a time of crisis. And honestly, we weren't sure whether or not people would think that there was a role, or if they would think that arts and culture should maybe take a step back during a pandemic or a time of crisis. But we saw that in wave 2, 95% of Americans saw at least one critical role that they thought arts and cultural organizations could be playing, help support their communities. And on the right side of the screen here, you can see the kinds of roles that people wanted to see arts and cultural organizations playing in terms of support. This was derived from a factor analysis that we did. We had, I think, 12 different response options people could select. And we used that factor analysis just to see kind of what are the patterns in the responses that people tend to select together. And coming out of that, it was clear that providing an emotional outlet was really core to people in terms of the kinds of support they might want. Wanting an excuse to laugh, to escape, a sense of connection to other people was really important to them. Offering connection and learning is the second most common at 77%. That included both kind of learning for opportunities for adults, as well as supporting kids who may have been doing some remote learning over the past year. And then providing practical help or support was also a theme here. I will say that one thing that we found really interesting, we'll talk later a little bit about emotional impacts of the pandemic and how that's worsened for many Americans over the last year compared to early in the pandemic. We found that the people who said that they wanted arts and culture to provide an emotional outlet were also really likely to be the people struggling the most with some of the emotional effects of the pandemic. And so there's some sense of triangulation between what people are experiencing themselves individually and how the kind of collective support of their communities that they want to see among arts and cultural organizations. A new question that we asked in this wave of the survey was about whether or not there's a role for arts and culture organizations to be addressing social issues in there that matter to their communities. And again, this is one where we really weren't sure what we would see in the responses. But we did find that 3/4 of Americans identified at least one social issue that they believed arts or culture organizations in their community should address. So we have a quick poll question I think Julia is going to help me with. It just asks about which social issue you think Americans were most likely to want arts and culture organizations to address. If you could pick one of them, we'll take a look at how that actually played out in our responses on the next slide. I'll give it a minute. While you work on that, I'll just say that as we're interpreting this data and thinking about what it means for arts and culture organizations, a lot comes down to the wording here, that what addressing social issues, what does it mean to address a social issue? There's a whole range of different levels of intervention or involvement that could be involved in addressing social issues. And so that's an area where we're really interested in potentially learning more, having some follow-up research that could explore that in more depth and nuance. Okay, Julia, should we close the poll? Can you share the results out? Oh, okay, cool. All right, so systemic racial injustice is at the top at 55%. Got a few more for political division, food insecurity, climate change. That's fairly well aligned with what people said. Let me go to the next slide. So you can see here that systemic racial injustice was also the most commonly selected response option in terms of the kind of social issues people wanted to see arts and cultural organizations addressing at 42%. I was a little surprised to see the COVID-19 pandemic so low on this list a year into it, but I don't know, you all apparently weren't, because I don't think anyone selected that one as the top one. Yeah, so the way this question, sorry, I'm seeing a question come in about just assuming that everyone expects arts and cultural organizations to address these issues. The way it was structured was we asked about which of the following social issues should arts and cultural organizations address in their communities, and there was an option that said none of these, and 24% of people selected that one. They were like, nope, none of these are things that arts and cultural organizations should be addressing in their communities. So just a sense of what that looked like more broadly. Okay. Another new question here is about the perceptions of systemic racism. And so we asked Americans, based on what they've seen or heard, whether or not they think systemic racism is present in each of the types of organizations below. We know that's a fraught question. Obviously, there's a whole range of kinds of organizations within each of these categories, but we wanted to get a sense of baseline. Are there differences by genres in terms of people's perceptions or experiences of systemic racism? And we found that there's a substantial minority of Americans who believe that systemic racism is present in each of these arts and culture organizations, types of organizations, but that there's a pretty wide range here, from a low of 16% for botanical gardens who believe systemic racism is present in organizations of that type, up to a high of history museums or attractions and art museums at 30%. For each of these genres, the proportion who believes systemic racism is present is less than the proportion who don't believe systemic racism is present. This was a 5-point scale. So on the left side are the people selecting a 1 or 2 on that scale, and on the right side are those selecting a 4 or 5. There are some in the middle who were neutral or who weren't sure what to put potentially here. But this was interesting to us. We also did some comparisons by race or ethnicity, and I'll show on the next slide the fact that ratings of systemic racism by African Americans are higher across all of these genres compared to the overall. So here's that. So consistently higher ratings among Black or African Americans. I might have expected to see higher ratings among other racial and ethnic groups as well. We saw that in a few genres. There might be higher ratings for a particular racial or ethnic group, but none of them are anywhere near the degree of difference or the consistency of difference that we see for Black or African Americans. So looking ahead, looking forward to the future, we asked a couple of questions about change, the degree to change, whether or not there's a need for change in arts and culture organizations in the future. And we found that more than half of Americans wanted arts and culture organizations to change in order to be more relevant for more people. That's a question we also asked in Wave 1, and we see that there's been substantial movement on this question over the last year, that the hope for this kind of change has nearly doubled from 30% in Wave 1 selecting it to 53% in Wave 2, which is really interesting. We have another framework that's a little bit narrower around kinds of change people might want to see. This one is really framed around in order to make organizations better for you in the future. And when we framed it that way, we found that almost everybody, 89%, identified some kind of change they wanted to see in arts or culture organizations. And again, we did a factor analysis because we have, I think there's 14 different response options that were present here. Happy to share the nuance of those if anyone is interested in them. But just to give a high level overview of the themes we're seeing in terms of kinds of change people want to see to make arts and culture organizations better for them, the top change was amplifying accessibility and new work to 70%. That included things like more accessible price points, broader operating hours and days of the week that organizations would be open and available, more frequently changing content within arts and culture organizations. The second most common kind of change was embracing equity and social change, and that included a lot of different dimensions of diversifying audience, diversifying staff of arts and culture organizations, diversifying the stories that are being told here. The third element here is becoming friendlier to all, which was an interesting one that had a couple of stems in it about offering more programs for teens or youth, about decreasing formality in arts or culture organizations and becoming friendlier, more welcoming to all. And then the final one was around deepening community connections, which included working with local artists, collaborating with other nonprofits locally, bringing voices of community members into exhibitions, a whole host of kinds of changes like that. Great, so this slide includes a lot here. It's focused on the ways that people have been integrating arts and culture into their lives over the last year of the pandemic, and the kind of different strands that arts and culture ways and strands that it can weave into people's lives. We were really excited to see that nearly all Americans, 96%, had engaged in some kind of personal creative activity, which we did define fairly broadly here, but that survey instrument is available on our site, or I can share more nuanced and granular information around the different activities that we talked about and measured here. But that was fairly universal. About 2/3 of Americans had engaged with arts and culture online during the pandemic over the past year. And then we also asked, the second two were a longer term frame. So thinking about the last few years, which included some pre-pandemic time, asking about their in-person attendance to a whole host of different kinds of arts and culture organizations was also very high at 96%. And then kind of a squishy fourth category here that included some community-based or participatory activities connected to arts and culture. Again, we asked about the last few years and found that about half of Americans had participated in at least one of these. This included things like a donation, purchasing artwork from an artist locally or nationally, volunteering at an arts or culture organization, participating in like a communal play or mural or art project, as well as protest or activism. Great. So diving into digital a little bit further, we found that 86% of Americans were aware of at least one type of online arts or culture offering over the pandemic, and almost 2/3, 64%, had participated in one or more of those activities. What we found most interesting here was that among all of the different genres of arts and culture organizations that we asked about, the digital offerings were really broadening reach to people who hadn't previously been to that type of organization within the last few years in person. So kind of diving into that universe of people using online content within each of these genres, what proportion had also been in person within the last few years to an organization within that genre versus what proportion were engaging online but hadn't recently been in person. And we found that there was a pretty significant proportion of people engaging online who hadn't recently been in person to any organization within that genre, which was exciting. It feels like it's an indication that digital offerings are broadening the reach of arts and culture organizations in potentially important ways. So we've broken out kind of the proportion of digital only users who hadn't recently been in person across some of these different kinds of genres. And there is a fair amount of variation. I think on average, we are at about half of people engaging online who hadn't been to a genre within the last few years, but we see really high levels for world music groups, folk music groups, architectural tours or design museums and cultural centers and libraries, a little bit lower for theaters, art museums, church, mosques, and temples. So interesting to see that there is potentially a broadening here. Our next question was really about, is that broadening happening in ways that might be engaging people who are less represented in the in-person arts and culture audiences of these types of organizations? And so this next slide really focuses on comparisons between these two groups. So focusing again on that digital user universe, comparing the in-person and digital group versus the digital only groups here. We were looking to see what proportion of those groups were Black or African American. And you can see that for folk music groups, for example, the proportion of people who were digital only who hadn't been recently in person who were Black or African American was 23% for folk music online users, versus the proportion who were engaging online and had also previously and recently been in person was just 3% for Black or African Americans, which is a pretty sizable increase in scale and size. We see this across most of the genres for Black or African Americans. I don't have the slide here, but we see it across, I think it's 8 of the genres for Hispanic or Latinx. It's very consistent effects also for income groups. When we look at people making less than $50,000 a year, we see much higher proportions of them among the digital only groups compared to the in-person and digital, and also for lower education levels. So along a number of dimensions that tend to be underrepresented in the in-person audiences of some types of arts and cultural organizations, we see both a broadening and a diversification of who's engaging online. Probably not surprising to many of you is the fact that most people aren't paying for the online content that they're engaging in online. Even a year into the pandemic, only about a quarter of Americans had paid for some kind of online offering related to arts and culture over the last year. And we found that when we asked people about what they valued or what was important to them around digital content, that free access was really important, even to those who could afford to pay, that was a really valued quality of online offerings. The people who had chosen to pay for some of these offerings told us that the reason that they had paid most commonly was really excitement or interest about the content or the artist that was most motivating in terms of getting them to pay. If the price was reasonable, that was also a helpful motivator in payment. Interestingly, supporting artists or performers was a little more motivating to them than supporting arts or cultural organizations themselves. We also found that about a quarter of those who hadn't paid for any online content told us that their financial situation really made it difficult for them to pay. So that's not the case for many of the people choosing not to pay for online content. It's an interesting conundrum for arts and culture organizations because producing digital content is expensive. And so there are some real questions about whether or not we continue to see this broadening and diversification of who's engaging online if we start to up the kind of proportion of content that's paid over time. I'd be curious to hear all of your reflections and thoughts about that in particular. So we asked about the importance of free content, and I shared that on the previous slide. This next slide focuses on the importance of the ways that online content can provide a source of connection. And we asked about that source of connection in a couple of different ways. Some of our advisors were really helpful in thinking about how to frame some of these questions, but we're curious to know how valued is online content for the connections that it allows people beyond their geographic kind of bubble and where they might be attending in person if they could, versus the ways that it can connect them to artists or organizations locally in new ways. And then the third dimension we asked about was connections to organizations that they themselves have been to or have some kind of relationship with. And we found that it was really important to people to use digital as a way to get beyond that geographic constraint that they find themselves in. I will say that people could rate all of these as important, so it doesn't, they didn't have to select or trade off between them, but we definitely found that digital content is particularly valued for the ways that it helps expand the kinds of things within people's network of arts and culture engagement. This question's a little bit of a kicker here. Life online after COVID. So we try not to ask too many questions where we're asking people to speculate into the future about anticipated behavior, because we all are not particularly great at predicting our own future behavior. But we did ask this one where we wanted to see on kind of a 5-point scale from always preferring online, sometimes preferring online, mostly preferring in person, always preferring in person. Where do people think that they'll fall when they can engage safely in arts and culture activities in person? And we found that the vast majority, 65%, really expect to prefer that in-person engagement going forward. 9% expect to prefer online. And interestingly, there's about a quarter of Americans who are somewhat agnostic, and that included both a sense that they would be making decisions based on the content, as well as just a general preference that's equal between online and in-person content. We did find some interesting patterns by race and ethnicity here, that Hispanic or Latinx Americans are much more likely to expect to prefer online going forward. 22% of them selected one of those categories versus 9% of the sample as a whole. And we also saw greater rates of expected preference for online engagement among Americans with certain types of disabilities going forward. But when we think about, what to make of some of these findings, the potential of digital to broaden and diversify engagement, with this finding about people's expected preferences, predominantly for in-person engagement, it is a little challenging to think about what kind of advice or recommendations to give to arts and culture organizations with these different kind of perspectives on the value of online engagement going forward. So I think this is my last content-based slide here, just about staying safe. So a reminder that this is back in May of 2021, so things may have shifted, but we did ask about what safety measures organizations could provide that might influence decisions about attending in-person arts and culture experiences. And enforcement of masks for visitors was really at the top of the list here. Reduced capacity and social distancing were also important. Outdoor activities were great. We found that only 15% of people said that they were really ready to attend with or without any of these safety measures. Most people said that these safety measures would make a difference. At least one of these safety measures would make a difference for them in terms of their in-person attendance. So kind of in summary, I just want to share that we really believe that the power of this social research lies in the kind of conversations that it's sparking and the ways that it might be shifting priorities or sparking experiments that lead to potential practices in funding and policy. And so with the recognition that arts and culture organizations are at a really wide range of places along some of the action steps that might emerge from these findings, from really being very early in their journey along some of these things to being the experts themselves and how to do some of these things. We do offer some considerations for practice just around increasing welcome in arts and culture organizations, addressing, exploring the possibility of addressing social issues in your community, continuing journeys and work towards becoming anti-racist organizations. Theme of meaningful community collaborations came through in a number of places here. I've only highlighted one or two of them in this brief talk, but it was definitely a through line and a lot of the findings. and then engaging more people through digital offerings, the potential of engaging and broadening who we might be reaching and connecting with through digital offerings. Okay, so just a very quick summary of what's next. As I mentioned, we have these national reports coming out. The qualitative study report will be released first, and then the culture track summary of the survey findings will come out probably either right before or right after Thanksgiving. The narrative study report will follow a little bit later in January of 2022. These focused reports will also be coming out. And then just a heads up that our colleagues at LaPaca Cohen are also planning some additional activation methods that we'll be involved in, including a transformation summit, which will be a virtual convening planned for 2022, and also a series of podcast episodes really exploring change and transformation in cultural experiences, also planned for 2022. So a few things to look out for coming up. Okay, that's all of my slides. I mostly focused on walking through them, so my apologies for not kind of juggling the chat as we went, but I am excited to dive into questions and circle back if there's anything that we need to connect back up on.
Thank you so much, Jen. So you stimulated a very lively discussion in the chat. So I'm going to try my best to just go over maybe some of the main questions in there and have you address those. And then if anybody who's asked those questions, please feel free to just chime in too if I'm not giving justice. So I think the first one is that we're all looking at the numbers, and we're also remembering how you described the sampling, and understanding that this was partly a probability sample and partly a non-probability sample, and wondering how much of that non-probability sample might be sort of driving the estimates here, because some of the estimates, especially in terms of participation at organizations, seems rather high. So I guess that's my first question, is whether or not you have looked at these estimates based on across these two different samples and whether or not they differ. And then I think two is, and this relates to a lot of the questions as well, are some of these estimates sort of conditional on attendance at an organization? Because again, I think that would help explain why some of them are a little high, which if you look at the chat, and I'll share the text with you so that you can see the details for sure, and you don't have to look at them now, whether or not some of these estimates are conditional on attendance, and maybe just give us an overall understanding of how those two forms of sampling actually worked together here.
It's such a great series of questions, and I appreciate the skeptical eye towards how we interpret and look at some of these findings. It's great. So part of the process of weighting that we did was actually to compare each version of weights that the team at NORC came with. We would actually run out data tables where we would look at just the probability sample and one column, and then the weighted total estimate that included both probability and non-probability list samples together to see where there might still be misalignment, right? Where are there other variables that the weighting scheme isn't yet taking into account that are causing divergence between those two samples of this data set. And so that was a very iterative process, going back and forth, and you change one thing and something else shifts a little out of balance, or in terms of that dynamic. But after those multiple rounds of iteration, every sample was within a 3% margin of error between the probability sample of the national level and the combined sample, which pulled from both that probability sample and the list. So we weren't able to get it completely, 100% overlapping in every dimension. And I think in part that's due to the complexity of the kind of artificial intelligence methods that they use to really look and see where there's variation and to adjust for that variation. But across the entire survey, that range or that variance is reduced to 3% or less. And I can share more about where that variance was hardest to get rid of if anyone's interested in more complexity there. But it has made us fairly confident in talking about this. It's still an estimate of the national sample. Even the kind of probability NORC sample is an estimate of the national, but one that we feel fairly confident in as representative of that full sample. And there are very few dependencies. I'm trying to think if there are any in this data that I've shared. But there aren't any, no, I don't think so. There aren't any places where we're zeroing in here on just attenders to arts and cultural organizations, for example.
So I guess, can you clarify that a little bit more? Because the list samples came from essentially audience lists from arts and culture organizations. So that already is conditional on those people attending the organizations, right? But then the probability sample came from a representative random group of Americans. So then wouldn't the conditionality already come into play for that list sample? So you know what I mean? So like it's the default. The people had already attended, and then therefore I don't know. So I guess like that's the part that I'm still not able to.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah, I mean, the idea here is that among the national sample, there's a certain proportion who are already on the lists of arts and cultural organizations and are attending themselves. And that what we're doing is we're downweighting the list responses substantially, and also downweighting some of the panel respondents from the representative sample who represent that group, because we know they're also way overrepresented in the list samples. So there's some pretty large weights at work here among some of these respondents, because we have a sample of 74,000 that we're trying to fit into a sample of 3,600 that are representative. So there's almost certainly some error that's involved there, but what we're trying to do is say that there's a naturally occurring proportion of the population that's on the list of these arts and cultural organizations, and maybe it's 20%, and we're going to fit this entire list sample into that 20% nationally, so that they make up the actual proportion that they would among the probability sample, so that the dependencies about being involved in arts or cultural organizations are in line with the levels that they would be at among the general population as a whole.
Okay, I don't want to take over, so I'm going to actually, there's so much more in the chat. Again, I'm going to just share the text with you. Can I ask anyone who put in questions in the chat that they really want to have addressed by Jen to unmute yourself and ask those questions?
Yes, please. I would love to. I would love to see faces.
Or any new questions too. Please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. I'm keeping track here.
I will say too, just to close the loop, there is a 10-page, very detailed methodology document on our website that goes into more nuance and detail of the sampling method than most people are interested in. But that's also a resource that's available for additional questions there.
I'm wondering a little bit if you could talk at all about the geography of the sample. So I'm curious specifically about the folks who said that they didn't really do a lot of attendance at arts and culture organizations prior to the pandemic and are now taking part in digital. And I'm curious whether there's any data that you have that indicates that geography may play a part in that, or any feedback that might help to sort of contextualize.
Yeah, it's such a good question, Cassie. I think that one of the lenses that we used here was urban, suburban, rural, as we were exploring potential impacts of geography here. And there were a few places where we do call out those impacts in the detailed draft of the report. And so I can share more there if that's a split that you're particularly interested in. Generally speaking, I sort of expected that we would see higher usage of online offerings from rural communities compared to suburban or urban communities. But in fact, we saw the opposite. There's not a huge differential in terms of online engagement across those communities here, but there are higher rates of engagement among people in urban areas compared to those in rural areas. And our hypothesis now, although I'd be curious to hear if others have other ideas or interpretations of that, is that connections to arts and culture matter, that if you're on the mailing list, if you see this in your community, or if you have relationships to those organizations, that you're more likely to then attend, be using some of their materials online. And that's what we saw in some of the regression analyses that we ran, that there are covariates here around sort of the geography of involvement that have to do with existing relationships to arts and culture, influencing what's happening there. So yes, that was something, I don't know that we've looked at it specifically among the people who are using online who hadn't previously been in person, but it sort of connects to that whole set of variables that we explored in the regression. I'd be happy to share more about that.
Great, Michael, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Jen. That was really interesting. I'm going to take you back very early in the presentation when you asked people about whether arts organizations should take on various social issues. And you had something like a 76% response. And I'm interested in this because we actually teaching arts policy this semester. This is one of the issues we're addressing in class. I'm wondering about sort of the details of what was involved there, because is it about how the organization functions, or is it about the art they present? And so, for example, an organization might deal with environmental issues and climate change by saying, we're going to operate a very green operation here. You know, we're going to be really, really careful about that. We're going to do all the right things in terms of being environmentally responsible in the way we run our organization. But the plays that we put on our stage, well, we're going to do Death of a Salesman and Twelfth Night and all the usual stuff. It's not going to be about climate change, but we're going to be an environmentally responsible organization. When you asked that question, was it about how the organization functions, or was it about what's put on stage, or was the question just sort of left up to interpretation by the respondent?
It's a great question, and it's helpful even to hear you play out some of the potential dimensions that this might be operating under. We asked about it very generally, and there was just one question about it on this survey. And the specific survey instrument is up on our website. I think the exact language is, you know, to what extent should arts or cultural organizations, or should the arts and culture organizations in your community be addressing any of the following social issues, something like that. And so that's part of the, like, it all hinges on what it means to address social issues. And I think you've highlighted a number of different ways that arts and cultural organizations could be addressing social issues in their communities that could all fall under that metric. So I would love to do a follow-up study that would really explore some of those different ways of addressing social issues. I do think there's some interesting research that just came out of AAM and Susie Wilkening Consulting, where they asked some questions about trust and about neutrality of organizations. It's museum specific, but that was just released a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you've seen that. But there's some interesting ways to triangulate a little bit around, you know, I think there are some questions here about, does addressing social issues mean taking a stand on them? Can you address them while still remaining neutral on them? What are the costs of giving up neutrality that are also really interesting to kind of explore and unpack together? I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you. I agree that it's a really fruitful area of potential future research and investigation.
Yeah, it's a hard question, so I didn't expect a simple answer. So
thank you, Michael. King Feng, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, thanks. I think Michael asked part of the question, but the more fundamental I'm thinking, which is really about how much people really know about organizations versus know about arts and cultural activity. So your first question right away just ask how important they are, these organizations to them. My understanding is I even don't know who they are. I even don't know how important, what do you mean by how important they are to me? So probably, I don't know. Understanding this question in the context of awareness of organizations versus art and cultural activity, I think that this is going to be very, very fundamental. This is the one thing. Second is related to the earlier question is, I wouldn't assume everyone just wanted them to handle the social issues. For a lot of them, especially during pandemic, we have all those things going on. I heard so many people around me just say, I just don't want to watch a movie. I just want to watch a dance. That's it. Maybe, you know, and then for organizations, I don't know, I wouldn't hold that assumption. And then the third one, I'm thinking, first of all, this is a wonderful data. This is a huge effort. But I'm wondering whether you have any of this results based on the supply side, the provision side, because watch a movie is very different from hearing, a concert. What kind of art activities would be more suitable for digital consumption? And under those policies, social distancing thing, what kind of art activities would be more suitable for production to supply? So on the supply and provision side factors, I think pretty important to understand the demand side, the consumption side patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you.
Those are such great points. I totally agree that, we know from our cognitive testing that people have a really wide range of sort of senses of what arts means, what arts and culture organizations mean, what kind of universe they're drawing on when we ask them about arts and culture organizations or the sector more broadly. And so I agree that there's likely some noise in the data because people are using different reference sets to answer these questions. We're not defining that for them here. And I agree too that data on the supply side is just as important. It has to go hand in hand. PDC's done some interesting work recently that's really focused on interviewing organizations, focusing on resiliency and future planning that might be of interest to you. They have this series of briefs they've been posting on their website, which have been really fascinating for us as we're kind of thinking about how do we think about the recommendations or the action steps that could come out of this while keeping that organizational supply side in mind as well.
Thanks, Jen. I think we had Zahaba, right? Yes.
What I wanted to call attention to is that earlier, Michael, I believe, had compared your participation number to SPPA. And to some extent, that goes right back to the major differences in definition of what art and culture is between SPPA and this study. I mean, the community center down the street from me that has concerts every few months would be included by me in this definition. It would be flat out excluded by SPPA. So one of the things that I hope this study does is at least make us more open-minded away from the well-educated upper middle class definition of what high culture is to a broader base. And that's part of the difference when you compare these data to SPPA.
That's right. That survey of public participation in the arts is something that we used as an input into the kinds of categories we wanted to ask about, but based in part on our own sense of the broadening of arts and culture offerings, and in part on the interviews we conducted with Black or African Americans about what arts and culture meant to them and how it fit into their lives. I think, as much as we'd love to be able to draw direct comparisons there, it is a little apples and oranges at this point. It's a great point, Zahaba.
Sunil, you have an interesting chat that is in sort of
I can vocalize that. Sorry, I can't see you all. But, I mean, I'm sorry you can't see me, but maybe there's nothing to regret there. Great to see you all. This is really awesome, and I really thank you, Jen, and everybody on this for a lively, as Joanna said, exchange. I just wanted to kind of genially push back on the 54% thing. So this has been a long-running, and those of you who've worked with the SPPA probably know, long-running narrative in that over time there's been a real attempt to broaden and deepen what we can ask and what we do ask in these questionnaires to get at all the range of engagement. And what we really love about this survey, Jen, and your work and others in the field who do this, is really getting down to interviews and doing this qualitative research. It's so important. to understand methods of participating that we maybe are not tracking well, and that we need to do a better job of making sure the question, that the instrument is flexible enough to capture a range of other activities we may not have anticipated. One thing I wanted to just stress here, though, in this case, the 54, so Michael pointed out, I think it's in the last, what is it, 2017 or something, survey where it says 54% of adults did, at least one form of in-person arts and cultural attendance. And so that particular statistic is actually, it's a grab bag of any of a range of things. It could very much include going down the street and seeing something at a community arts center. We're really, I don't like the word agnostic in this context, but let's say indifferent to the venue in this case. It's really what did they do in terms of attendance? So we try to be very broad with those questions, and even if it involved breaking away for some trend data. And we're still open to that. So, I mean, we really welcome this. And I'd love to hear, even offline, if people have ideas of art forms or activities. And Jen, of course, this goes to your team. I think we've had a great dialogue on and off about, things that could go into these surveys so we can be more capacious and useful, both on the supplies and demand side, as you said. So thank you very much for raising these questions.
Such a good point, Sunil. I wonder, does the SPPA definition, does that include things like watching TV or movies, going
so
to
that,
church,
not in that 54%
temple?
number, but we do include that in the in our questions about around digital or electronic engagement. So there are questions about watching various types of activities through TV or other devices. Movies, going to movies is definitely there. What's difficult to do, I think, is get a number that encapsulates every single activity in the SPPA because of modules we use, and that has to do with weighting. But other than that, we do, so you could actually break, so the 54% excludes TV, but we could give you like the 74% who do any kind of digital or electronic engagement. Still probably lower than what you found, but 74% would be in that other category. And then there's going to the movies, which is a different figure altogether.
It's helpful.
Great, thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Jen. So we are about to end. I want to just ask if there's one last burning question. All right, how about Jen, if there's anything else you'd like to say, I want to give you the last word here.
No, I'm eager to read through the chat in detail and may reach back out to some of you if you'd be willing to continue some of the conversation. We are, it's such a privilege to be able to really grapple with national data in these ways, and we really enjoy bringing other minds to that kind of grappling. So I appreciate your thoughts and you all listening and kind of being a first audience for some of this research.
Great, thank you, Jen. And offline, I've been already talking to my colleagues about also wanting to get a hold of these data and work with them. So I think you've just sort of stimulated so much interest. So thank you very much for sharing all of this. We've been really, really following the work of Slover Linett quite closely, especially since you launched this data collection effort. I want to thank everybody for coming, for engaging so much. It's always such a pleasure to have everyone here and asking questions, which is what we're about. So please do join us in a couple of weeks. Again, when we have Jacob Brownstein from the University of California, Berkeley, he'll be talking about public investment in the arts and cultural agglomeration, evidence from the New Deal. But I'd like to just give a round of applause for our presenter today. Thank you so much, Jen. We had such a great time listening, and we hope that everyone will come back and join us. And yes, we're excited to see all of the results in the reports come out very soon.
Wonderful. Thanks again for the opportunity. Have a great
Thank
day,
you, Jen.
everyone.